Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to you all who have joined us today for the webinar on effective load restraint. Our webinar will be presented today by Tania Wilson, who's from the National Transport Commission. In today's webinar, Tania's aim will be to assist your understanding on how to use the load restraint guide and point out a few key elements that could assist you within your business. Tania joined the NTC in 2011 and has worked on several national transport policy reforms. Tania was the project manager responsible for updating the load restraint guide, and will share tips on using the guide effectively today. Now, a few housekeeping things here. We'll be aiming to have an approximate 30-minute presentation today. We will be recording the webinar, so if you have, so you don't have to take any notes. There will be question time available towards the end. The recording of the slides and the slide deck will be made available to you once the webinar has concluded. My name is Francis Waddell, and I'll be your webinar moderator today. So if you do experience any issues or have any questions, please send them through. As you can see on the screen, there is a questions box, which you can certainly send anything through, and I will moderate these throughout the webinar itself. If you have any questions, as I said, for Tania today, don't be shy. Please type them in and we'll address them towards the end of the presentation. Now, without further ado, I would like to warmly welcome Tania Wilson to begin the presentation today. Thanks, Tania.
Thank you, Francis. Thanks for the opportunity to present this webinar today. I hope your members will find it useful. So today I will be talking about the new 2018 Load Restraint Guide, which was released in February this year. And so for those of you that don't know, the guide can be downloaded for free from the National Transport Commission's website, which is ntc.gov.au. And you can also order hard copies through our website. And there are two sizes available. There's the glove box size A5 version and the larger A4 version as well. So a lot of information in the guide is similar to what was in the 2004 edition. However, the way the information is presented has changed. So based on the feedback that we got from users when we were doing the update, we've tried to make the guide more user-friendly by changing it to a modular structure, simplifying the language a bit, using a lot of simple diagrams and adding some more worked examples. And generally, the feedback that we've received has been positive. So, as I mentioned, the new structure is a modular structure, and so it's designed so you can use each module independently of the others. So there are the 6 modules listed up there on the screen. And the first one is the overview module, and I recommend that everyone reads this one. So it covers the foundational information about load restraint, and that includes your legal obligations, some of the different load restraint methods, and the key elements that make up a load restraint system. The second module is the loads module, and this module contains a range of different load types and specific advice provided on these different load types. And we've included the common load types that were in the previous guide, such as the general freight, the contained loads, and the large loads. But we've also added a couple of new ones in there. So there's now livestock, logs, scaffolding, and turf as well. The third module is the vehicle and equipment module. So this provides information about standard vehicle structures and the commonly used restraint equipment. Now, in particular, this now contains information on rated curtains, which was an area that was missing in the previous guide and something that lots of people wanted to see more guidance on. Module number 4 is the working out the load restraint. And this contains some of the examples for specific load restraint cases. and it helps you to work out how much load restraint you need. And we're going to go through a couple of these later in the presentation. And the last two modules are the certification module, which outlines why you should have your load restraint system certified and also who should do it, and the technical advice module, and that contains more detailed information on the load restraint calculations. Okay, so as Francis mentioned, the focus of today's presentation is primarily on how to use the load restraint guide to help you design your load restraint system and to better understand how much restraint you need. So I'll be drawing your attention to the key elements you need to consider when developing your load restraint system. And as I mentioned, I'll take you through a couple of the worked examples in the guide. At this point, I'd just like to emphasise that the information in the load restraint guide is guidance only. It provides information on how you can meet your legal obligations, which are the performance standards I'll cover in a moment. However, you can restrain using other methods, provided that you can demonstrate that they meet these performance standards. And one thing to note is that performance standards haven't changed since the 2004 edition. So the wording has changed slightly, so they could be included directly in legislation. However, their legal intent hasn't changed, so that is still the same. And these performance standards are up on your screen. So they're covered on page 4 of the new guide. And basically they say that you need to restrain your load so it doesn't fall off under normal driving conditions. And that includes heavy braking and also minor collisions. And that your load doesn't move around in a way that affects the stability or weight distribution of the vehicle. So to do this, your restraint system must be strong enough to hold 80% of the load, total weight of the load forwards, 50% of the total weight of the load sideways and backwards, and 20% of the total weight of the load upwards if your restraint system relies on a limited vertical movement or on friction, where you need to ensure that your load remains in contact with the friction surface at all times during the journey. So those are your legal obligations. So moving on to designing your load restraint system. Now the guide outlines 10 steps or key elements that you need to think about, and which I'm going to touch on briefly now. Just a note that these steps, they're covered in more detail in the guide on pages 11 through to 22. But we've broken the steps down into 3 groups, and that's planning your load, so loading and unloading the vehicle, and driving the vehicle. So we're going to look at the steps for planning your load first, and they're the ones that are up on your screen there. Now, the first one is to understand your load. So this means knowing what your load is and what its characteristics are, such as its weight, its dimensions, where the centre of mass is, and the level of friction. So it's this information that will help you choose your load restraint method and to work out how much restraint you need. At this point, you can also check the load types in the guide to see if there's any specific guidance for your particular load. So I listed some of the load types earlier, such as the pipes, pallets, and contained loads. However, there's a full list of the load types available on page 29 of the guide. The next step is to make sure the vehicle you're going to use is suitable for the load you're carrying. So while you may not have a choice of vehicles to use, this step basically means checking things like the load capacity of the vehicle to make sure you're not overloading it, looking at the dimensions, particularly at the rear of the vehicle, because an excessive overhang can affect the vehicle's steering and stability, and also the roll stability, particularly if you're carrying a load with a high centre of mass. where there's an increased risk of vehicle rollover. The next step is choosing a suitable restraint method, and this will be largely informed by the load you're carrying, the vehicle that you've got, and the equipment that you have too. So broadly speaking, there are the two basic methods. So there's the tie-down restraint, and that one relies on friction, and it uses the tie-down lashings to clamp the load to the vehicle. And this is probably the most common restraint method used. The other method is the direct restraint method, and this one doesn't rely on friction. So, and it includes things like containing, blocking, and attaching. So often a restraint system will use a combination of these methods to meet the performance standards. And we're going to look at a worked example for tie-down restraint and an example of containment using load restraint curtains a bit later in this presentation. But if you want more information on the different load restraint methods, have a look at page 23 in the guide. The fourth step in the planning the load is positioning your load. And I'm sure most people who've been driving trucks for many years already know that where the load sits on the back of your truck can affect its stability and weight distribution. The guide provides some high-level guidance on some high-level tips, on positioning your load, such as keeping the centre of mass low and keeping it close to the vehicle's centre line, spreading the load evenly across the deck, and also sharing the weight between the axles. It's important to note here that however you load your vehicle, you still need to comply with the mass and dimension requirements for heavy vehicles. So if you're not familiar with these, I suggest visiting the National Heavy Vehicle Regulators website for more information. And the last step here in the planning section is step 5, and that's to check your vehicle structures and restraint equipment to make sure they're in good working order. And just another note here, we always recommend using rated equipment wherever possible. So that's the planning your load. So let's move on to the second group of steps, which is loading and unloading the vehicle. So the first one here is making sure the load is stabilised. And this particularly applies to tall loads, such as 200-litre drums or gas cylinders, but also be aware that a load can be unstable if it's on a base, such as the timber dunnage, where that base is narrower than the base of the load. So basically a load can tip forward if the length of the base is less than 80% of the height, or it can tip sideways if the width of the base is less than 50% of the height. And I think there are some diagrams on page 16 that sort of show you this. So tips for stabilising these loads include placing them against rigid structures, such as headboards, or if you have a number of, say, drums or cylinders, strapping them together to form a stabilised pack. The next step in this group is to make sure you understand and use safe work practices when loading and unloading the vehicle. So as many people already know, there have already been lots of injuries and in some instances deaths that have occurred, particularly when the truck is being unloaded. So the guide provides some high-level principles and actions aimed at preventing these accidents. So some of the important things to do, and particularly to establish a loading and unloading exclusion zone and to make sure no one goes into it. And also to set up a driver safety zone, which allows a line of sight between the driver and the loader. I strongly encourage everyone to have a look at page 17 and 18 of the guide, just to familiarise themselves with these safe work practices. And the final step in this section, in the loading and unloading, is to make sure you use enough restraint. So we're going to go through the worked examples, but just a reminder that the load needs to be restrained so it doesn't come off in all expected driving conditions. And that includes heavy braking and minor collisions. And also that part of the load or all of the load coming off is a load restraint breach. Okay, and the last two elements in the driving system, I'm not going to talk about these too much, but we've got make sure that you allow for changes in the vehicle stability and steering and braking when they're driving a loaded vehicle. And also just a reminder to check the load and the restraint regularly during your journey. So that's a brief overview of the 10 steps or key elements that you need to think about when you're designing your load restraint system. So in the guide, you'll find these, all these steps are on the load restraint system checklist, which is on page 22. And this is a handy sort of one-pager you could run through before your journey. So that's what it's designed for. So you can rip it out or photocopy it. So on that note, so as I promised, we're going to run through a couple of the worked examples. Excuse me, from the working out load restraint module. So as I said, one of the tie down ones, so we're looking at case 1, which is an example of tie down restraint with the webbing straps. Now, the first thing you need to do when working out how much restraint you need is to identify what it is you're restraining. So in this example, you'll see in the circle on the side there, it's the 3 rows of pallets at the front of the truck. And we've assumed each pallet weighs 700 kilos. And you also need to know what equipment you've got to work with. So again, in this example, we've assumed that you've got 50mm webbing straps and a truck winch as a tensioner. So, and that has an average pre-tension there of 300 kgf, which is the kilogram force. In the guide, I think we've also provided some average pre-tensions that can be achieved with different tensioners. And I think this table is available on page 24 of the guide. But just a note that it's important to know what tension you can get with your particular equipment. The next step, so next step is to choose a suitable restraint method based on the load you've got and the equipment. So in this case, it's going to be the tie down restraint method. So once you've decided that the tie down method is the best method for you, the first question you need to ask yourself is, can you block the load? So it's recommended to block the load wherever possible, because this significantly reduces the number of tie-down lashings you need to restrain it. So in this example, we're going to say that the load can be blocked against the headboard at the front of the truck there, which we've assumed is a rated headboard. And another thing to note here, that the load isn't blocked if there is a gap greater than 200mm between the load and the headboard. Also, or there's a cumulative gap along the trailer, so between the pallets, that's greater than 200mm. Okay. The next step is to actually work out the numbers. So for this, we firstly need to know the weight of the load that we're restraining. So in this example, we've got each pallet weighs 700 kilos and there's 2 pallets in the row. So therefore the total weight of the pallet row is 1400 kilos. And to meet the performance standards, each row needs to be restrained separately. So if a row doesn't have a lashing on it, then it's not going to be anything clamping it down and preventing it from moving, particularly sideways and upwards. Okay, to work out the numbers, you also need to know the friction level in the load. The guide has a table which covers some of the typical friction levels and that's on page 24 of the guide, but I've also put it up here on the slide. So using this table, we can see that timber pallets on a steel flatbed truck, which is assuming smooth steel on timber, has a medium friction level. And the other piece of information that we need to work out how much restraint we need is the tie-down lashing angle. So for this example, we've assumed that it's greater than 60 degrees, but we do recommend that you keep your lashing angles greater than 60 degrees where possible, so more vertical, because as the angle gets lower, so closer to the horizontal there, less effective the tie-down lashings become. So in some instances, you can use things like dunnage to increase the lashing angle by putting it under the load to lift it up, or also on top of the load to increase the load height. Okay, so now we've got all the information. So we know the total weight of the pallet row, the friction level, and also the lashing angle. So now we can work out how many straps we need, and using the tie-down lashing tables. And these are all in the back of the guide in the appendix. So there are a number of tables there for different straps and tensioners, but we're going to use the one for the 50mm webbing straps and the truck winch because that's the equipment we're using. So from this table, you can see that when the load is blocked, which is circled at the top there, when the friction level is medium, which is on the side of the table, one strap can restrain 2,000 kilos. So that's when the lashing angle is greater than 60 degrees. So as our pallet rows, in this example, weigh 1,400 kilos, you'll need one strap for each row of pallets. So that's basically it for working out the numbers for the tie-down restraint. Just a couple of tips when using the tie-down restraint method. Again, block the loads where possible, and this means the whole front of the load. So for this example, if you're looking at the table for the unblocked loads, which is also in the appendix, you can see that at least 3 straps per pallet row would be required to meet the performance standards. So that's a lot more straps. The other thing you can look at doing is also increasing your friction levels by using rubber loading mat. And as I mentioned already, trying to keep those lashing angles greater than 60 degrees, so more vertical. And have a look at the other tie-down lashing tables in the back of the guide to see what equipment and tensioner combinations are available. We've just chosen some of the more common ones, but hopefully in the future we'll be able to add some more as people request them. So that's a tie-down example. The next example I'm going to go through is a rated curtain example. And this one's case 8 in the guide. So same as with the previous example, you first need to work out what it is you're restraining and what equipment you have. So in this example, we're going to work out the restraint for the first 3 rows of pallets, and that's circled there in group 1 on the side. And this time we're saying that pallet A weighs 600 kilos and pallet B weighs 750 kilos, and that each row is the same. And the equipment we've got here is a curtain-sided vehicle. Okay, so to use rated curtains without any other restraints, you need to make sure that the load is adequately blocked, and that's forwards, sideways, and rearwards. So in this example, we're going to say that the load is fully blocked in the forward direction by a rated headboard. So now we need to check that the load is fully blocked, sorry, sideways, which is where the rated curtains come into it. And so just a note here that rated curtains do only provide that sideways restraint. Now, there are a couple of ways that the curtains can be rated, and that's by the pallet space or the pallet width. So in this example, if your curtain is rated by the pallet space, you would need to have a rating capacity that's greater than the 750 kilos, because that's the heaviest pallet in the row. And if your curtain is rated by pallet width, in this example, you'd need a curtain that had a rating capacity greater than 1,350 kilos. Because that's the weight of the pallet A and B together. So that's the weight of the pallet row. In addition here, to make sure the curtains have, in addition to making sure the curtains have that adequate rating capacity, you also need to check that there aren't any gaps across the width of the load. And so for it to be fully blocked sideways, the cumulative gaps should be less than 100 millimeters. Okay. So finally for this one, you need to also check the rearwards blocking. And in this example, the load is not blocked rearwards. Now I've had many people comment that you would never load a truck like this anyway, but it's been for illustrative purposes only. So it's not blocked rearwards because there is a gap greater than the 200 millimeters at the back of the group one. So in this situation, you would need to block that gap at the back or use extra lashing strappings to make sure that it meets the performance standards. So that's the worked example for rated curtains. There are a number of other examples for rated curtains in the guide, including the use with mezzanine decks and also the multi-drop loads. And I encourage everyone to go and have a look at them. The other one in the guide is there's a couple of examples on direct restraint with attachment. And I'm not going to go through them in detail today because they're a little bit more complex. There are quite a few calculations and they probably don't lend themselves that well to this sort of forum. But I do encourage you to go and have a look at them because they are laid out quite well in the guide itself. But just a couple of tips in relation to direct restraint here. When you're working out the numbers, the goal is to determine what strength lashing you need, and that's affected by the direct lashing angle. But unlike the tie-down restraint method, with direct lashings, you're looking to keep the angle as low as possible, but not horizontal, but as low as possible. So generally a good rule is a slope of 1 to 2, and you'll see that on the side there, as that gets you sort of a 90% effectiveness in your lashings. And also a tip, just to remember to check that angle for all directions of movement. So that's the two worked examples I'll take you through today, and that sort of brings me to the end of the presentation. I hope you found that useful. As I mentioned at the beginning, the new load restraint guide can be downloaded for free from the NTC website. But I also encourage you to seek out some additional training if you'd like to know more about load restraint. There are a number of courses out there, and you can do a Google search and find one that's close to you. But finally, if you are in doubt about your restraint system, and particularly if you're carrying a specialised load, we recommend getting it certified by a load restraint engineer, just so you can be sure you're meeting the performance standards. And so on that note, I'll hand back to the NatRoads team here and see if there are any questions there. So.
Brilliant. Look, thank you very much, Tania. And everyone, we've come to the end of the webinar. So as Tania mentioned there, we'll move on to questions now. We also have David Johns available here from the Member Services team, who can also contribute to any questions that anyone may have. So I'll just check to see if we have anything. No, so it doesn't seem to be any questions at the present time. David, did you have any questions at all for Tania, or anything that you'd like to I guess seek further clarification on, or Tania, is there anything additional that you would like to to provide the members on any insights?
No, just I guess a comment that the guide is fairly general, so it has to be because there are many different load types out there. So we do our best to sort of give some general guidance, but it can't cover every piece of equipment and every load type. But it is designed now. We've put the performance standards into the legislation, so with the intention that the guide becomes a bit more of a dynamic document, so you don't have to wait another 14 years for it to be updated. And so we do encourage people to get in contact, and if there's things that they would like to see in there that they think would be useful, please let us know. Yeah, so particularly with new equipment and things like that.
So Tania, there is one item which is perplexing some of our members, and that's to deal with the restraints that actually come in, be it on containerized loads or loads from other countries, and the challenge around making sure that the restraint being used on that load meets the Australian standards. Is there anything that you can indicate to our members in relation to that challenge? Because quite often, our standards are quite clear, very well clearly marked on the tie-down strap or whatever. It can be challenging finding that on something which has come from overseas, and then that ability to confirm whether it meets the Australian standards or what. Is there any tip that you can offer them on that?
I mean, I guess we do sort of encourage you to get as much information, but I realise that it is quite difficult when things are coming in from other countries, and we're not sure where they're coming from and what. But as I say, we do sort of encourage people to look at the ratings on the equipment themselves, and if they can't see them, then I think there are questions to be asked, because you can't assume that it is rated. So I guess whether you're willing to take it under those circumstances or not, or it should be a condition that they can provide you with the information to give you the certainty you need that it's rated. So again.
And I suppose that is the element for a lot of the drivers. It is to make sure that they've satisfied themselves in relation to the documentation, in order to make sure that their load is restrained properly, that they are aware of the weights and things like that, not just accepting that someone's known what they're doing when they're loading the vehicle.
That's right, and again, it's not as reasonably practical as well. If you've asked as a driver, we certainly don't expect you to know every piece of equipment, and that's not your responsibility, but it is your responsibility to ask and to find out. So as much as you can, get that information off the person that's handing it over to you. So
brilliant. We do have a question here from one of the members. Do you need downforce load restraint in a load with load restraint curtains?
It depends. So and as I was talking about in that example, you need to see if you've got any gaps in there, then in the load that are greater than the 200 millimeters, then yes, you'll possibly need other restraints. But if your curtains are strong enough to restrain that sideways, if they've got that rating capacity, then no. So. Fantastic.
Thanks, Tania. Without any further questions, I'd also like to add to the webinar that obviously you can get a copy of the load restraint guide by visiting the NTC website, and download a soft copy, which would be a PDF document. And also too, for anyone attending the webinar today, that on the NatRoad website we do have copies available, the A4 copies, which you can purchase just for a small fee of $6, just cover postage. So certainly head to our website where you can order those, and they'll be sent out to you as soon as you place that order on the website. I think that's all the questions that we've come through for this morning. Thank you to everyone who took the time to submit questions, and also for attending today. And thank you, Tania, for hosting the webinar, and for David being here. There'll be a short survey, everyone, once we stop the webinar, which would really appreciate your feedback to take the time. If you have any further questions, please obviously don't hesitate to either contact the NTC or your member services personnel here at the NatRoad office, who will be able to assist you. Thanks very much, everyone, and have a great day.